Burkina Faso has completely stopped accepting foreign aid, a move that surprised many. It raises questions about why a country would reject financial assistance, global support, and positive recognition from Western nations. The secret behind this sudden change is worth exploring. Welcome to ADAC's Zone. While the world was focused on economic predictions, international meetings, and promises of donations, Burkina Faso quietly made a bold decision that most developing countries are afraid to consider. Without any big announcements, praise from Western media, or diplomatic events, the government decided to completely stop foreign aid. This wasn't a temporary stop, but a deliberate and planned halt. They are no longer accepting new loans, grants, or humanitarian help that comes with political conditions. Instead, Burkina Faso has chosen to run its country, fund its projects, and manage its future using only its own resources. This decision is not by chance. Trust in international systems is decreasing across the global south. The promises made through aid have not led to significant lasting changes. Roads were built, but they rarely helped rural communities gain power. Schools were opened, but the education often promoted foreign viewpoints rather than local history. Food was imported, but it ultimately harmed local farming. What was presented as generosity often came with hidden conditions, compromises, and subtle control. Burkina Faso observed this and then made the surprising choice not to ask for aid again. What makes this decision even more remarkable is not just the refusal, but the quiet confidence behind it. This isn't a country struggling to survive alone. It's a nation showing that it always had enough to stand on its own. Gold, which was previously extracted by foreign companies, is now being refined within the country at its own high-capacity refinery. Local rice production has increased, not just to feed its people, but to become a strong export. Agricultural projects, which were once overlooked due to imported goods, have been reorganized into self-sufficient industries. This change isn't just about money. It's also a change in mindset. The focus is no longer on what others can do for them, but on what resources they have always had but hesitated to use. International observers, still relying on old ways of thinking, haven't fully grasped what's happening. They anticipate negative consequences, economic hardship, or even collapse. However, they are missing the point. Burkina Faso isn't isolating itself. It's protecting its independence. Refusing aid isn't about arrogance. It comes from being tired. It's the exhaustion of pretending that relying on others is a viable strategy. This quiet decision reveals an old truth. Aid often arrives late, stays too long, and leaves deeper problems. Burkina Faso has declared that it no longer wishes to be saved. It simply wants to survive on its own terms. For many decades, development in Africa has been viewed as something to be given, not something to be grown. Burkina Faso has now redefined this idea with one decisive action, closing the door to donations and embracing its own internal strength. Of course, Western nations will not celebrate this moment. Aid organizations and diplomats have always preferred to see countries like Burkina Faso as students, not as equals. This decision removes the teacher from the room, leaving the future open for Burkina Faso to create its own path. This isn't a protest against global interconnectedness. It's a reorientation of purpose. The message is subtle, but its impact is huge. If one of Africa's poorest countries can declare financial independence without collapsing, what excuse do other African nations have? The world is now watching, some with worry, others with hope. But one thing is clear: an irreversible change has begun. A country has stopped asking for help, and instead of failing, it is slowly, steadily, and independently rising. But how did the aid system fail so completely in the first place? Why did a system intended to help end up weakening entire nations? This is where the true story begins. When Burkina Faso stopped accepting aid, many assumed the country was cutting itself off from the rest of the world. News reports, when they appeared, warned of isolation, unrest, and economic danger. The underlying belief was clear. Refusing aid meant choosing collapse. But what if that idea is completely wrong? What if accepting aid was never a true lifeline, but a slow process of entanglement? And what if walking away from it wasn't foolish, but the start of true freedom? To understand how significant this moment is, one must understand how aid has influenced countries like Burkina Faso and across the global South. Aid, as it's generally understood, isn't just about providing money. It's about influencing decisions. In theory, development aid is supposed to improve roads, schools, hospitals, and economies. In reality, it often serves to entrench existing power structures, keeping countries in predetermined roles and within donor-approved plans. In the name of progress, aid imposes plans created in foreign capitals, promoted with trendy words, and enforced through financial dependence. For decades, the world told countries like Burkina Faso that growth was impossible without foreign intervention. Development was presented as a gift, but this gift came with rules. Accept a loan, and you must reorganize your budget. Take a grant, and you change your agricultural policies. Receive training programs, and suddenly your legal system, education, system, and even your military strategies reflect someone else's ideas. The result is a subtle but damaging erosion of a nation's ability to think for itself. This is what Burkina Faso is freeing itself from. Breaking away from aid isn't a retreat. It's a rejection of invisible colonization. By moving away from donor-driven development, the country is reclaiming something far more valuable than money: its right to make its own mistakes, learn, adapt, and make independent decisions. It's choosing the discomfort of dignity over the comfort of being controlled. Those who defend the old aid model point to statistics like lower child mortality rates, improved school enrollment, and built clinics. However, they rarely discuss how sustainable those improvements are. What happens when the funding stops? What happens when a change in leadership in foreign capitals cuts off the money? What happens to a country that relied on donors for its basic functions and is suddenly left alone? That's the real danger. Not rejecting aid, but building a nation on borrowed support. Burkina Faso has seen this happen around the world. It has witnessed leaders rise on promises of foreign grants, only to fall when that support was withdrawn. It has seen hospitals built by non-governmental organizations collapse when funding cycles ended. It has seen policies shaped to please foreign embassies rather than its own citizens, and it has chosen not to repeat this pattern. Critics might argue that isolation comes at a cost. But Burkina Faso isn't isolating itself. It's aligning with its people, its land, and its long-term interests. It's forming new partnerships based on mutual respect, not dependence. It's demonstrating that cooperation doesn't require giving up control. In reality, the aid model didn't fail due to a lack of resources. It failed due to a lack of trust. It treated sovereign nations as helpless children, not as equal partners. Over time, the most damaging effect wasn't economic, but psychological. Countries forgot how to dream without external approval. Burkina Faso is now rebuilding that ability. It's learning to stand on its own, even if it stumbles. It's embracing the risks that come with true independence. And that's why this moment matters. For the first time in a generation, a country has chosen its own path without asking anyone for directions. But what exactly is Burkina Faso building? What industries, projects, and sources of strength are making this experiment possible? Burkina Faso isn't creating wealth out of nothing. It is finally using the resources it always had, but never truly controlled. The wealth was never missing. It was simply mismanaged. The problem was never poverty. It was exploitation disguised as partnership. For decades, the country's gold left its soil and disappeared into the vaults of foreign companies headquartered in other continents. Its farms were undervalued, and its land, workers, and markets were left undernourished while feeding others. That's what's changing now. At the core of this new economic plan is the principle of keeping value within the country rather than just extracting raw materials for others to process and profit from. The highlight of this transformation is the creation of Burkina Faso's first national gold refinery, a facility capable of refining 400 kilograms of gold every day. For a country ranked among Africa's top gold producers, this is more than just a technical upgrade. It's a fundamental shift in power. For decades, the gold industry operated under a simple but devastating rule. Burkina Faso digs, and others make the decisions. The ore would be extracted by foreign-owned companies, processed abroad, and then imported back as finished products, while Burkina Faso received very little profit. Now, that cycle is being broken. With in-country refining, Burkina Faso is stopping the flow of wealth out of the country that perpetuated its poverty. But this isn't only about gold. It's also about agriculture, which is the true heart of the country. For years, despite having fertile land and a willing workforce, Burkina Faso imported rice and processed foods at a huge cost. Tomatoes grown in local fields would rot before they could be used, while imported tomato paste from Europe flooded local store shelves. That absurd situation is now being addressed through national investment, not foreign loans. Burkina Faso has built a modern tomato processing plant worth over $8 million. This amount is significant, not just because it shows financial commitment, but because it proves that even modest funds, when used wisely, can bring about structural change. Farmers who once sold crops just to survive are now supplying an industry. A stable supply chain has replaced a mere survival chain. The same idea applies to domestic rice production. Burkina Faso is no longer just growing rice for itself. It's becoming a supplier to neighboring countries through initiatives like La Mulenne Sahel. It has transformed from a food-dependent nation to a regional food contributor. It's no longer about charity. It's about trade. Every move the country makes now seems based on one principle: keep the wealth within the country and let its people benefit first. These aren't huge projects designed to impress the world. They are focused, strategic investments aimed at building resilience. The wealth isn't just measured in tons of gold or bags of rice. It's showing up in jobs, dignity, and less reliance on imports. And this is the unexpected irony for the global system, that a nation once classified among the world's poorest could become a model, not because it received the most aid, but because it stopped receiving any at all. What Burkina Faso is demonstrating is that it doesn't take billions in donor funds to develop. It takes control over what is already yours. But how did so many African nations lose control of their wealth in the first place? How did a resource-rich continent become poor in power? To answer that, we need to look at the deeper issue, not what was taken, but how it was taken. Long before gold refineries and tomato factories, even before formal independence, Burkina Faso's destiny, like much of Africa's, was already being shaped elsewhere. It wasn't just the gold that was taken. It was the systems, the voices, and the very right to define what progress meant. In their place, a foreign plan was imposed, one that subtly told the African mind, "You are broken, and we will fix you." But this fix came at a price. As colonial flags were lowered, aid flags were raised. The exploiters didn't leave. They simply changed their tactics. Mining contracts, trade agreements, structural adjustment programs, and donor-led reforms were not designed to build independence. They were designed to manage it, ensuring that newly free nations never strayed too far from their assigned role. Exporters of raw materials and importers of refined dependency. The cleverness of this system lay in its disguise. It didn't arrive with weapons. It arrived with financial plans. It used terms like capacity building, good governance, and investment climate. It presented itself not as conquest, but as genuine concern. Yet the results were strikingly familiar. African nations were once again building railroads, but they didn't own the routes. They were growing food, but not feeding themselves. They were exporting minerals, but importing suffering. This wasn't poor management. It was deliberate design. By the 1980s, much of Africa was forced into economic reform programs by the IMF and World Bank, known as structural adjustment. Under these programs, countries were told to open their markets, cut government spending, sell off national assets, and welcome foreign investors. In return, they received loans and aid packages supposedly meant to stabilize their economies. Instead, many of them crumbled. In Burkina Faso, the effects were clear for decades. Public services weakened, state-owned industries collapsed under forced privatization, and multinational corporations moved in and dictated terms. Entire generations grew up believing that their country couldn't function unless an outsider showed them how. The loss wasn't just physical, it was mental. People stopped trusting their own governments. Foreign experts were brought in to explain how their land, their people, and their problems should be managed. Burkina Faso's break from aid, then, is more than just a financial decision. It's an act of remembrance. It's a refusal to forget what aid replaced. By building with its own wealth, the nation isn't just creating infrastructure. It's rebuilding its identity. It's reminding itself that before anyone offered help, the land already provided, the people already worked, and the future already existed. This is why the change is so unsettling to those who once held influence. Because it doesn't just threaten economic power. It threatens the narrative. It rewrites the story where Africa is always dependent, always needing external validation and resources. Burkina Faso is now living proof that this story was never true. It was just told convincingly enough to be believed. And perhaps the most radical part of this shift is its quietness. There are no angry speeches or grand declarations to the United Nations. The message is delivered quietly through policies, production, and pride. Aid is no longer being requested. The doors to dependence are closing one by one, not with hostility, but with clear purpose. But if Burkina Faso is reclaiming its past, the next question is whether it can protect that memory in the long run. Can this model survive pressure from the global system? Can it be expanded, defended, and copied by other nations? What happens when a nation takes back control of its direction, but the old world tries to pull it back? Burkina Faso has made its decision. It has walked away from the negotiating table where deals were made quietly and sovereignty was exchanged for short-term stability. But the looming question now is not just whether this act of defiance was justified, it's whether it can last. Because walking away from aid is one thing. Staying strong when the world tries to pull you back is another. History provides many warnings. Countries that defied global financial systems have often been quietly punished with sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and economic sabotage disguised as concern. And even though Burkina Faso may no longer be seeking help from donors, the influential entities around it haven't disappeared. Western institutions still monitor, still pressure, and still warn of consequences. Aid may no longer flow in, but influence takes many forms. It hides in trade agreements, in how media portrays things, and in the calculated silence of former allies who once claimed friendship. Already, whispers have started that Burkina Faso is falling behind, that its leadership is too extreme or too risky. that its reforms are not being properly supervised. These aren't just opinions. They are early moves in a larger strategy, a subtle campaign to discredit independence before it spreads. Because if one nation can break away from the system and survive, then the system itself begins to seem optional. That's a dangerous idea for those who built their power on the illusion of necessity. But survival will not depend on international approval. It will depend on something much deeper: internal unity. Burkina Faso's ability to stay on this path depends on whether its institutions, its people, and its leadership can remain united. When the first challenges appear, will they hold strong when markets fluctuate, when shortages test patience, when opposition from within or abroad starts calling for a return to the old ways? The answer lies in the kind of independence being built, not one made of slogans, but of strong systems. The test will come not just from outside, but from within. Can national industries become self-sufficient? Can public services rise to meet the needs once met by foreign NGOs? Can political leadership remain unwavering under global scrutiny? It is here that the real work begins, not just in rejecting the old world, but in proving the new one can actually function. And yet, there is something quietly working in Burkina Faso's favor, growing momentum across Africa. The general feeling is changing. The younger generation doesn't have the same emotional attachment to foreign generosity. They are more questioning, more restless, and more ready to believe in their own strength. In the markets of Bamako, the classrooms of Niamey, and the streets of Conakry, there is a rising confidence, a sense that the continent is no longer waiting for rescue, but preparing for self-determination. In this sense, Burkina Faso isn't just an isolated case. It's becoming a reflection for others. The more it stands strong, the more it shows what other nations could achieve. Its tomato factories, its gold refineries, its rejection of aid, these are not just policies. They are signals. They say it can be done. You don't have to wait. You don't have to ask. You don't have to beg. You can begin. Whether this model becomes the new standard for Africa will depend not only on its results, but also on those who defend it. The old world will not give up easily. It will try to return with friendlier approaches, smarter agreements, and louder warnings. But Burkina Faso has chosen to listen to its own people, not outsiders. And that may be its greatest advantage. So now the world watches, not just to see if Burkina Faso can stand, but to see if it can lead. Not with armies or headlines, but with an idea. The path to freedom was never paved with aid. It was always hidden beneath the ground, waiting to be walked on with determination and a full understanding of its history. This is not just a break from the past. It's the quiet beginning of a new future, one where Africa is no longer told what it needs, but decides for itself.